So it has to be okay because I can't do anything about it. No, I'm not going to start over. Okay, I'm 10 minutes into the class and I forgot to turn on the recorder. So, but basically what I've done is I've tried to show you that apocalyptic literature was not unique to the book of Revelation. In fact, Revelation is one of the last ones to be written. What I tried to show you the last few classes is that apocalyptic literature had, I believe, this is my opinion, because scholars are so varied in their views about this, that you really come down to opinion. But I believe that inspired prophets used what came to be known as apocalyptic expressions. What we looked at over the last two class periods, the sun being darkened, the moon being turned to blood, the stars falling out of the sky, etc., etc. Those are not necessarily considered apocalyptic by scholars. But I believe they were the precursor to true apocalyptic. The first biblical, there's a lot of expressions of apocalyptic expressions in Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, but the first true biblical apocalyptic is the book of Daniel. And I believe that it gets its origins from the prophets, from the Old Testament prophets. That's my opinion. What I don't like about studies of apocalyptic, like this book right here, is they study non-biblical, extra-biblical apocalyptic, and then create the concept of the genre from the non-biblical, because there's so much in abundance. And really we only have Daniel and Revelation and comments preaching of Jesus in Matthew 24 that would be considered apocalyptic. And so they rate the non-biblical apocalyptic with biblical apocalyptic. And I don't agree with that. I think that we should, if we're believers, then we believe that the book of Daniel was given to Daniel by God. Okay. These other guys, like Enoch and so on, the book of Enoch, you got a scribe over here that's coming up with this vision and writing it out. He's drawing his visionary concepts, his images from biblical apocalyptic, from like Daniel. But he's not being directed by God to do that. He's not being shown a vision by God. At least I don't believe he was. And the Jews that put together the Old Testament canon of Scripture didn't believe they were inspired by God. So we've got a couple of we've got a few God-inspired apocalyptic pieces. Daniel, a few small pieces from Isaiah and Ezekiel and so on, and then a full-blown apocalyptic in the book of Daniel, and then a full-blown apocalyptic in the book of Revelation, and then some that are typical of prophetic expressions that were given in Isaiah and so on from Jesus as he describes the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 as the angels come. Let's look at that one. We looked at it last week. Let's begin this class. Let's begin this class with looking at that again, Matthew 24. I demonstrated last class period why this piece is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, which goes all the way back to chapter 23. and where Jesus mentions the destruction. And then chapter 24 begins when Jesus comes out of the temple with his apostles. They start pointing out to him the temple buildings. I indicated the reason they're doing that is because he just mentioned that their house, the temple, was going to be left to them desolate in the previous verse of verse 38 of chapter 23, and then associates his coming with the desolating of the house. They come out of the temple. They're pointing out these huge, beautiful temple buildings that Herod had been enhancing and rebuilding. And so he says, verse 2, do you not see all these things? All what things? Temple buildings. Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another which will not be torn down. So he's predicting what? The destruction of that temple. Now the really interesting thing, and he'll refer to the book of Daniel in verse 15, but in Daniel, when Daniel talks about this, in Daniel 9, his comment is that the temple, or Judaism, would come to a complete end, or that temple aspect of Judaism, when that temple is torn down, will come to a complete end. So what Jesus is saying is the end of Judaism as you know it, that's based on the temple, is coming to an end because it's going to be torn down. So they say, verse 3, and he was sitting on Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? What things? The destruction of the temple. And what will be the sign of your coming? Because he said that in the last verse of chapter 23 that they wouldn't see him again until they said, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then he says, and of the end of the age. You see, like I said, Daniel said that the next time the temple is torn down, because Daniel is prophesying in Babylon, the first temple has been destroyed. He predicts that the second temple's coming, but when it's torn down, he said, that's it. That's the end. That's the end of that Judaism. Now, Judaism didn't end. Judaism continues to exist today. In reality, you and I are grafted into Judaism. Jesus is a Jew. And all of his apostles are Jews. And this book, the New Testament, was written by Jews. But it's Judaism full blown. It's Judaism that has grown up into what we call Christianity. Okay? And it's, I found it interesting when I learned that. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting because our debate has been, are we going to let the Jews in?
Yeah.
And the reality is are they going to let us in? But Jesus guarantees that we come into the new Judaism as equal heirs with those who were born physically Jews. Okay? So, anyway, Jesus is talking about the end. And then he comes down to verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. And he says in verse 15, let's go back there, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him who is on the housetops not go down to get their things out that are in the house. And let him who is in the field not turn. This is talking about the Daniel 9 piece. And it's talking about the Roman army coming into Judea, or Israel, the holy place. Not talking about the temple, because once they got in the temple, it would have been too late to do anything. But basically, when you see the Roman army, the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about, which was the Roman army, when you see them entering into the Holy Land, what we call the Holy Land, then get out. Flee to the mountains. And then he comes, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, people read this and they say, well, this is the end of the world. No, it's not. It's typical apocalyptic expressions that the prophets used. Jesus wasn't the first one to say these things in talking about a judgment from God. If you've got margins that show where Old Testament passages are quoted from, verse 29, I've underlined them, where the references are. Isaiah 13, Isaiah 24, Ezekiel 32, Joel 2, Joel 3, Amos 5, Zephaniah chapter 1, Isaiah 34. All of those are, what's in here are quotes from all these Old Testament passages. Jesus didn't invent those expressions. They were used by the previous prophets. And they were used in reference to God's judgment on peoples. And not just judgment, they are used in reference to salvation, God's salvation for the elect. So what is typical of biblical apocalyptic, and even the apocalyptic that's non-biblical? What's typical is that God's people are being oppressed. God's going to judge the oppressors. And God's going to save and bless his people who have been oppressed. Now, the judgment of the oppressors of God's people and the salvation and blessing of God's people who have been oppressed is all described with these bizarre images and by angelic warfare and images that are like I said, really bizarre. You've got in chapter 12 of Revelation, you've got a giant dragon, a red dragon, who we learn as we read down is Satan. And this dragon is on the earth in the picture, and his tail knocks a third of the stars out of the sky. Well, the earth couldn't even support the tail, much less the dragon. I mean, this is a picture. And the picture, it's bizarre, has a meaning behind it. What's the meaning? And that's the purpose of apocalyptic. Is it gives imagery, and the imagery has meaning behind it. And the meaning behind the imagery is what we're after. And this was so familiar. When Jesus used these terms in Matthew 24, verse 29 through 31, they weren't going, oh, what? The world's going to fall apart and angels are going to come and we're going to see all this. No, they weren't doing that. They understood immediately that this was typical prophetic judgment scenes. That Jesus was predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, the judgment of Jerusalem, and the salvation of his elect who were suffering. And it's interesting that he says, and then verse 30, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. What is that? Evidence. Jesus says this is going to happen. Jerusalem's going to be surrounded by armies. Well, when that happens, then that's the evidence.
Bill, you were talking about in Matthew It also says that it will be like the days of Noah.
Yeah.
In the end times.
Well, and I don't believe it's the end times. Let's go down to that. Verse 37. Well, let's look at it. Verse 37. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore be on alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. Now, the typical way this is understood, verse 40, there shall be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Who is the one that's taken? The Christian, right? That's the rapture. The Christian. And the one that's left is who? The wicked person. Well, let's come back. Verse 37, for the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking. They were marrying and giving in marriage. So who are the they? The good or the bad? The wicked. Until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand. Who's the they? The good or the bad? The bad. They did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. Took who away? The bad. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So, who was taken in the days of Noah, the good or bad? Who was left, the good or bad? Noah and his family. So, 2 men in the field. One is taken. So who's taken? It has to be the bad, if we're going to follow the illustration. So it's not the rapture of the good people. It's the wicked that are taken. And that goes along with Jewish expressions. Being taken is a bad thing, because they're not talking about being taken up into the sky and being with Jesus. When they say somebody was taken away or taken during an invasion, that means the wicked were taken away. They were killed or taken into captivity. So you've got a parable here. Jesus is explaining what he meant by his judgment scene, that the wicked are going to be taken away and the righteous will be left. And that's why he says, if you come back over here, verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to get the things out that are in his house. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. If this is the end of time, what good does that mean? If this is talking about the end of the world, what's the whole point of fleeing to the mountain? It doesn't do any good to flee to the mountain if it's the end of the world. This isn't a piece talking about the end of the world. This is a piece talking about God's judgment upon Jerusalem. As we saw last week in chapter 23, leading up to 24. Jesus tells them, your house, the temple, that's the Jewish expression for their temple is called their house, the house. He said, your house is going to be left desolate or destroyed or empty. And he said, you'll not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So he connects those. These aren't two different subject matters. Then he comes into 24, and he's walking out of the temple, and the disciples go, look, Look at these buildings. Why would they do that? Had they never been there? Yeah, they'd been there many times. But now they're pointing out the buildings. Why? Because Jesus says that it's all going to be destroyed, or it's going to be desolated. And he says to them, don't you understand what I'm telling you? Not one stone here is going to be left on top of another. So they sat down on the Mount of Olives, which overlooks the Temple Mount. I've been there. And overlooks, just right across the valley. And you can see it. And they're saying, they said, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And so Matthew 24 is about that. He doesn't just suddenly in verse 39 jump to a new subject. Because there's nothing in the text that would indicate that. He's talking about what they asked him. Tell us when Jerusalem's going to be destroyed and the sign of your coming. And so he sits down and tells them. And in fact, if you go over to Luke 21, hold your place there, turn over to Luke. Luke is writing to a Gentile audience, or to Theophilos, which is a Gentile name. And he presents the same sermon, Luke 21. He presents the same sermon that is presented in Matthew 24 from Jesus, but he interprets it for us. Okay? Now, here he said, if you flip back to Matthew 24, verse 15, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, etc. Now, Luke 21, verse 31, even so you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I said that's not what I'm looking for. Verse 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are in the midst of the city depart, and let not those who are in the country enter the city. So Luke just tells us what Jesus was saying when he said, when you see the abomination of desolations, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, Luke translates that and says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. Are y'all following what I'm saying here? Okay, what's my point? Well, my point is to help us understand that the book of Revelation was not a mysterious book to the first century Jews, especially first century Jewish Christians. It was typical, very typical apocalyptic language. That the symbols in there were symbols. They were pictures that had meanings. And they understood those symbols. They weren't mysteries. They knew how to read it because they'd had that whole list of apocalyptic literature that I read to you earlier before I started the camera. That whole list, there's like 20, 25 books there that were popular amongst the Jewish people for 200 years before Jesus. They were used to reading it. And they were used to understanding it and deciphering it. So when John wrote the book of Revelation, they were not confused about it. They knew that, and John, when we get there, which will be in a week or two, I'll go in and I'll show you from chapter 17, John explains who he's writing the book about. And we don't have to guess at it. if what's interesting, if you look at Revelation, let's turn over to Revelation chapter 1. Revelation 1. John begins the book. And he says, the revelation or the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, which God gave him, which God gave who? Jesus. God gave this to Jesus to show to his bondservants the things which must shortly take place. And he sent and communicated it by his angel to his bondservant John. And so, when does he say these things are going to take place? They must shortly take place. Now, this was given to John probably, I believe, in the 70s. I know most people would argue that Revelation was in the 90s. I believe it was given, John had it in the 70s. That's my opinion. We don't know for sure. But it's in the first century. So if it's things which must shortly take place, and we say that, over 2,000 years later it still hadn't happened, really? That shortly take place? And then you come down to verse 3. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near. The time is near. Now he's not saying, well, that's God's concept of time. No, because he's referring to people. He said, blessed are you if you take heed and do these things. To you, why? Because the time is near. It's going to affect you.
Well, Bill, do you think because we have not had those books you read that are not inspired or not included in the Bible, because we haven't been taught them like the Jews had, or I guess the early Christians, that's why we can't understand that this is already taken place?
Well, yeah. Okay, the question is it because we don't have today the books that the Jews had and that we have not studied them is why we don't understand the book of Revelation or passage even in Matthew 24 that, we think it's referring to the end of time. We don't understand them. Yeah, I think that's it. Now, like anything else, we should have done our study. And I think Western Christians have got a bigger problem with this because we've been the scholars that dug into apocalyptic literature did so without Jewish influence. And so they read this stuff and they say, well, this is the end of time. Well, that was an assumption on their part.
Do you think they also did it to scare people into becoming?
They did it to scare people to become Christian. No, maybe somebody did that, but I think they were honest mistakes. They just were uninformed. They had not really done their study. And even, in my opinion, for the benefit of the video, even Leon Morris, who is a scholar, an older scholar that I highly respect, a conservative scholar, he takes apocalyptic to refer to end of time. I don't. And I think it's because of the influence of premillennialism, which has been around a long time, and really originated with Gentile Christians early on. Why Gentile Christians? Because they didn't understand the Jewish genre of apocalyptic. they developed this premillennial, they thought, well, Revelation's talking about a 1,000-year reign. Literal 1,000-year reign. No, it's not. We'll see why when we get there. But that's where the problem comes. And I think most of the things that we get confused about are because we've not allowed our brothers, our Jewish brothers and sisters, to have proper influence on us.
So what do you think the demeanor was of the people that read this or heard this at this time? Were they afraid or scared, or were they?
Yeah, what I believe the book of Revelation, and we'll see why when we get there. I'm going to try to start it next week. What I believe the book of Revelation, and I think I can support this, is that John writes it in the 70s, my opinion. The persecution of Christians is getting ready to rise up by the Roman Empire. The Romans are going to start persecuting Christians and killing them. And so John writes the book to tell them this is coming. This is coming. And has already started in Rome. And God's going to deal with them. And he tells them the source of this is from Satan, the red dragon in chapter 12. He's the source of the persecution. He's going to use the Roman Empire. They're going to kill a bunch of you. And God says, but I'm going to get them. I'm going to deal with them for that. And though you're being killed, you're going to come through this okay. You're going to be shining like stars when it's all said and done. Now, that's what I believe the book of Revelation is about. A persecution that has begun. Why did he need to do that? Because God had used the Roman Empire to punish Judaism, to punish Jerusalem. Well, now the Roman Empire turns its fury against Christians, and God wants them to make sure they understand this persecution, this destruction is not from me. It's from Satan. I used Rome to punish Israel. I'm not using Rome now to punish you. This punishment, this persecution against you Christians is from Satan and his angels. And I'm going to destroy them for that, and I'm going to punish Rome for it. I'm going to punish Rome for this. But you're going to get through it. You're going to suffer, but you're going to get through it and be blessed. That's the message of the book of Revelation. Questions?